Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to my review of Star Trek Starfleet Academy. A little bit delayed, but here it is all the same. So what do I think of this game? Well, I think it's actually pretty decent, especially coming off the back of DS9 Harbinger, which was, well, terrible. But yeah, this was pretty fun for me to play. It's not the best flight sim game ever. In fact, I'd probably call it at best an average flight sim game, space flight sim certainly. But as Star Trek games go, I'd say this is pretty fun, especially if you are a Trek fan. Then you will particularly enjoy this for the FMV cutscenes, which have a lot of good Trek elements going on there, especially with the appearance of Kirk, Chekov and Sulu. The game was developed and published by Interplay and released in 1997. There are some minor issues getting this to work on modern systems. You have to do a little bit of tweaking and playing around, especially to get it working in widescreen. But it's doable. I had to basically play this through GOG, Good Old Games, because the Steam version didn't work for me, it just crashed. So yeah, I had to purchase the game through GOG, and then I had no problems. I was looking through basically a guide on the internet on how to basically get this game working properly, and with a couple of extra bits and pieces to fix things, or again, as I said, make it widescreen. But aside from that, let's jump into the various elements. So we'll start with the story, I guess. This was the Starfleet Academy series that never was, at least until the recently announced Starfleet Academy series for New Trek. I'm not sure I really am interested in that, but certainly I remember at the time, back in the day, I would have been pretty happy to see a Starfleet Academy series or something like this. So this was pretty good. I think it's a good choice to start as a cadet in something like this, rather than being a seasoned officer already. So obviously it's an excuse to teach you the various aspects of how to play the game, and basically training you to be a good Starfleet officer, and I really like that aspect of the game. I like that the game has a heavy focus, or at least emphasis, on dialogue choices, and though they're not particularly complex and they don't have a massive impact on the game, they do impact certain things like how well your crew performs. There are several fail states, so if you don't choose the right path, you end up being expelled from the academy, and also to unlock the very final mission, you actually have to do very well, otherwise the last mission is basically hidden from you. As I said, the game makes heavy use of FMV cutscenes, so this is basically green screen in its early years, and it shows, but I can easily forgive that for the technology of the time. There's loads of little clips of various encounters in the missions with other Starfleet captains or aliens or other people basically, and it really helps add a lot of variety to the missions, the type of people you're encountering, and it's pretty good production value, especially with any of the aliens. So you see Klingons, I think we see Romulans, we saw a Gorn, and there was this other race called the Venturi, I think, and yeah, it's all very well done, and I really like these little bits of flavour to the missions. Instead of just going here, shoot this, defend this, or whatever, yeah, it just really helps with the storytelling aspect. The transitions between these scenes are a little awkward from time to time, because you just get suddenly a black screen and a dialogue box, so it's not perfect, but I really like it, and I appreciate that. I'm actually wondering how expensive this was to make, given you had three well-known Trek alumni. You had Kirk, Chekov and Sulu, but you had your cast of cadets, and then you had lots of other supporting characters. I mean, this must have cost quite a bit at the time, but it's impressive. It's good to see. I like it. And who doesn't get a kick out of seeing Captain Kirk and the others? Particularly, I like seeing Chekov get more to do. I mean, Chekov never really gets a lot to do, certainly not in the films, as perhaps a bit more than the original series, but it was just nice to have Chekov do something other than just make a sort of little report saying, or yes, Captain, or nuclear vessels, that sort of thing that he's kind of known for. I think Shatner was also doing a fairly good job as Kirk. He didn't seem to be phoning it in, though I've obviously seen him better as well. But yeah, he did a good job as far as I'm concerned. And same for Sulu, he was fairly competent. And I always liked that Sulu got more of a character arc going forward, and he eventually ends up captaining the Excelsior. That was another Star Trek series we never got, but hey ho. But let's go through the main cast, shall we? So we have 6 cadets in our team. We had Captain Forrester, we had Sturrock, McGear, Acton, Robin, and Corin. We basically had three primary characters here. We had Captain Forrester, which is basically the player, and then Sturrock the Vulcan, and then Magia the Andorian. The other three characters were more like side characters. Corin probably got the most attention out of them all. He got some decent attention early on, but after that is basically used as the guy who has a fancy quip or some other comment to make on a situation. Robin was used a couple of times, mostly to do with the bombing plot, and once at the very last mission, but that was about it. The most underused character was Acton. She appeared twice in any kind of notable scenes I remember. So she had an argument with Corin, and then she came to have a talk with Forrester about Corin, and then just was pretty much invisible the rest of the game. Very minimal dialogue, even in missions, so that was a bit of a shame. But I understand you can only have so much to go around, especially when there's so many characters in this particular game. I thought Forrester was okay. He generally comes across as a bit panicky and indecisive in the way he delivers his line, the actor that is. I mean, he's not the best actor in the world, but, you know, he did okay for the material that he had. But I wasn't blown away by the performance or anything. Sturrock, I think, was a fairly decent Vulcan performance, a little stilted and dry, but, you know, to be fair, I think doing a Vulcan right is really hard. Obviously, it's perfected by Nimoy, and we have had a few other good Vulcan characters like Sarek and Tuvok, a couple of others, but it's very easy to just play a Vulcan as emotionless, flat, and dry. But the thing is, Vulcans are not emotionless. They have emotions, they're just buried. They suppress them. So there has to be some nuance there and letting something peek out but appearing controlled. Whilst I think he didn't quite manage that, he was okay. It's not the worst Vulcan performance I've ever seen. Finally then, we've got Magia the Andorian. She was not great. I think the issue I had with her was whenever she's trying to be angry, which is, you know, a fairly established canon thing for Andorians. They're kind of aggressive, but yeah, I don't think she particularly handled the angry scenes very convincingly. She was much better when she was being a bit more quiet, or if she was doing her job well. So yeah, not too bad, but not too great either. And then we have a bunch of other side characters. We had Commander Rothrow, who was the commandant of Starfleet Academy. This guy only has 3 acting credits, including Starfleet Academy, but I think he did a pretty good job. He has good gravitas, he comes across with authority. So yeah, definitely one of the better, well, probably one of the best guest actors outside of the big 3 that we had. So good job to him. Then we had Milan, Mr. Punchy Face. I mean, Jesus, this guy was literally hired just for how smug and punchable his face looks. I mean, fair play to the guy. You did it well. The only thing is he's a very one-dimensional character. His only purpose is just to be an arrogant, punchable dickhead. There's no real explanation of his motives or the background which causes him to be part or leading this Vanguard movement, but he served his purpose well enough, but he's also a stupid idiot. But, you know, we'll get to that in a minute. There was also Faith Gage, basically a pretty face with an ulterior motive, played competently, nothing amazing, but yeah, no quarrels there. And I think that covers most of what we had. So yeah, let's talk about then the Vanguard and, you know, the sort of the background plot of Starfleet Academy. So most of the time you're obviously just training and getting to learn how to be a Starfleet commander, but there's this background plot of what's happening outside the Academy. So we had this colony that's wiped out, and it's blamed on the Klingons, basically, or people assume that it's the Klingons, perhaps rightly so, given the belligerence and hostility of the Klingons, but, you know, we need to do a proper investigation. So the Vanguard are this basically human-centric, anti-alien organisation that believe that Starfleet's just letting aliens run all over them. Kind of fairly typical trope in sci-fi, but it's a particularly more interesting one for Star Trek, considering how inclusive and, you know, utopian the Federation is, because this is a thing that challenges those ideals, and that's interesting to me from a story standpoint. Unfortunately, the Vanguard themselves are just fucking dumb. Their whole plan is stupid and has no chance of really succeeding in the long run, even if it succeeds in the short term. I mean, let's think about this. Their overall arcing plan was to assassinate the Federation Council and key members of Starfleet Command all at once, and then install Kirk as their new leader, and then what? What happens then? what happens, what do the other Federation members think about this? What does the other captains in Starfleet think about this? This would basically lead to a civil war, essentially. A pretty short civil war, I think, but a civil war nonetheless. And it would probably lead to the Federation being too weak to defend itself from the Klingons, which is, what this group was trying to stop in the first place. So all they're doing is just opening the Federation up to being invaded, because you just wiped out the entire command staff and decision makers of the Federation. And this is made even worse when you consider, well, Kirk would probably easily say no to this. So what then? Do they kill Kirk? And who's going to be their leader then? Is it going to be Milan, Mr. Punchy Face? This young cadet, he's going to lead the Federation? What was the plan here? It's just dumb. And not only that, where is Starfleet intelligence? How has Starfleet intelligence not caught this very wide plot to assassinate so many people? I mean, this is a complex plan you're about to initiate. You need lots of resources. You have to have people in place. The bigger your conspiracy, the harder it is to keep it a quiet conspiracy. That's just the law of numbers. I realise I'm probably looking too much into this. I mean, it serves the purpose of the game fine, but when you look deeper into what the Vanguard were planning and how they're planning to implement it, it's dumb. But, whatever. It's fine. It's fine for the game. I'm not going to rail on it too much. I just like to nitpick things sometimes. I did think it was a little bit contrived that, if you do unlock the final mission, you end up flying the Enterprise. I mean, of course, we all want to fly the Enterprise. I get it. That's fine. It didn't need to be the Enterprise. It could have been any other Constitution-class ship or an Excelsior ship or something else. So, yeah, a little contrived, but it's okay. I'll let it slide. So, with the story out of the way, let's move on to the gameplay. I think the gameplay is generally quite fun. It's not particularly in-depth or complex, but I wasn't hating it. I wasn't too frustrated by it. It's quite quick, much quicker than I expected it to be, because I have better memories of Klingon Academy than I do Starfleet Academy. And Klingon Academy, I seem to recall, the ships are a lot tankier, the fights last longer. The ships themselves don't feel very weighty. They basically fly around like fighters, rather than large lumbering starships. Now obviously there's different classifications of starships, so a Klingon bird of prey should kind of maneuver like a quick, not quite fighter, but a fast-moving sort of light frigate or corvette. That's fine. But something like a Constitution class or a D7 should be a bit more, lumbering, a bit slower moving. And yeah, as I said, the ships aren't very tanky. I mean, shields go down very quickly, and once that happens, 3-4 well-placed torpedoes, and that's it. The ship's destroyed. It's not necessarily a problem, but it just feels a little bit basic. There isn't really any weapon variety at all except your phasers and your torpedoes. The only variety there is just the number of phaser banks and torpedo banks you have available to you. There is the TrackTribe as well, which you can use as a sort of defensive or offensive tool as you need to, but I didn't really have a need to use that very often, if at all. There was also a bit of a lack of flyable ships in the missions themselves, so you basically fly in a berth, I think once, maybe. Miranda a couple of times. For the most part, you're in a Constitution class, and then you get to fly an Excelsior class 2 or 3 times. The Excelsior class was by far the most fun to fly, just because it was a beast. Had much stronger shields, it had a lot of firepower, and so you just wiped the floor with pretty much anything you came up against. The only issue you might have is if you had enough bad guys shooting at you, then yes, you could be overwhelmed, but otherwise, yeah. Excelsior was definitely a nice beast of a ship. You do technically have arcs. You've got forward and rear weapons. Not all ships have them. It kind of actually bothered me that the Constitution has no rear firing weapons. It just has 4 forward firing phasers and a couple of torpedoes, whereas the Miranda has a couple of rear facing torpedo banks. It's just, it always bothered me a bit, but whatever. The AI is, it's okay for its era. It has a tendency to want to ram you from time to time, but it wasn't too much of a problem. Ramming, if you do ram something, it tends to be fairly critically bad for you. Either the ship is destroyed or your ship is just severely damaged, and so it tends to end missions pretty quickly. Even if you ram something really slowly, it tends to be game over. So that's not the greatest thing. I guess if I were to compare this to flight sims of the era, such as Wing Commander, TIE Fighter, X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, that sort of stuff, it feels a bit too much like that kind of combat in terms of how the ships move and fight. In my opinion, Star Trek Starship combat needs to feel different, weightier. bigger, and I think that's why this feels basically like an average flight sim, and why, you know, Wing Commander, TIE Fighter, that sort of stuff feels like they're superior games of that era, in my opinion. Now, to be fair, they did try to vary this up a bit by adding other stations, so things like energy management, damage control, science station, navigation. Most of this was, for me, fluff. I mean, the damage control part was the only thing I actually went to on a regular basis, just to sort of set priorities, because you do get damaged quite easily, so you want to set priorities for what's going to get the most energy to repair systems like, you know, your warp engines, your weapons, your shields. But the rest of the stations I never really used. I didn't have a need to use them. Also, I think combat continues whilst you're in these screens, and so it's nearly impossible to actually manage what you're doing whilst being attacked, particularly how quickly your ship can die. There is also subsystem targeting, so you can sort of knock out, warp nacelles, engines, that sort of thing. But for me, it was completely unnecessary to do in any of the missions. And since you can actually turn your phasers to be disabling to just stop a ship, it wasn't necessary. I know it's necessary for the future games, but for this at least, it was a thing that was there that didn't affect the game for me at all. The navigation console kind of reminds me of a Final Unity. If you remember, I commented on how you have this massive map, hundreds of star systems you can visit, which has no real purpose. There's no sort of random events, or minimal random events at Final Unity. But in this, it just seems to have no real purpose, except perhaps one mission I can think of where you get multiple destinations as part of your mission that you have to go to as part of your patrol routine. And that's it. And I couldn't quite figure out how to actually use that properly to find my destination. The dialogue choices I've already mentioned. I really like this aspect of the game, so rather than just go here, do this, you have to talk your way in and out of situations, which is pretty true to the ideals of Starfleet and Star Trek in general. The missions themselves, there's some good variety here. There's some nice callbacks to Wrath of Khan, Balance of Terror, a few other TOS references as well. It's good stuff. However, some of these missions do suffer from poor scripting or just outright bugs, which makes the missions difficult or nearly impossible to complete, but that's only really an issue for the last mission. I had an issue for 2 or 3 missions where the game just randomly ended the mission. I just got the cutscene saying, you didn't do well, you failed the mission, but I hadn't even completed anything yet. It just randomly happened, and I have no idea why that happened. The very last mission was a nightmare. If you recall, I couldn't complete that mission initially, so I just put it up as it was, and then I finally got some advice on how to complete it, and it turns out that me firing my weapons through my joystick was the problem. If I fired my weapons through the keyboard, the scripting was fine, but if it was the joystick, for some reason, somehow the script realizes you're not firing in from the keyboard and it fails the mission, and that's really strange. And there were a couple other issues with that mission as well. Although it's basically a dialogue boss, there's so much dialogue that it's very easy to screw up, and there's quite a bit to do before you get to that repeating this mission just gets frustrating and boring. So although I love the concept of the last mission basically being a dialogue boss, it's very Star Trek, I don't think it was implemented very well at all. So the last mission is a bit of a letdown, to say the least. But yeah, overall it was okay, not bad at all. So graphics, not too bad for the time. I think contemporaries were probably a bit ahead of this, but it was lacking any real notable visual design beyond the ships and the stations. Space itself looks pretty boring and basic. Planets and the occasional background nebula about the only thing you tend to see other than sparsely populated stars. The ship and station models and textures themselves are fairly decent for the time. They're nice and clean. You can blow bits off the ships, but it's very basic. There's no damage modeling, and there's minimal particle effects that you can see on the ships as well. There wasn't a huge variation of different ship models. I mean, we had the 4 Starfleet ships. We had basically a Klingon bird of prey, a D7, and a heavy battlecruiser. We had 1 or 2 Romulan vessels, and we had the Venturi, and then we had a couple of freighters and a couple of sort of space creatures as well, and that's about it. It's not terrible. It's fine for what it is, but a bit more variety would have been nice. I mean, Chekov Academy has a lot more variety in the number of ships you tend to encounter, at least 2 to 3 times the number of ships in my memory, if my memory serves me anyway. Getting the game in widescreen is possible, as I've already mentioned, but it does create these little artifacts on the screen when you move your cursor about. They're very minor though, and you basically quickly forget about them, especially when you're in combat. You just don't notice, so it's fine. They're very minor. torpedoes look good, but the phasers, the Starfleet phasers bother me. They use these kind of slow-firing pulse phasers. They look terrible, and the audio is just wrong. It's completely wrong. It doesn't sound like anything from Star Trek. It's this kind of standard fare weak pew-pew noise, and it's not that iconic sound that we remember from either TOS or that one time they used phasers in the motion picture films, which is The Wrath of Khan. None of the other Kirk era films used phasers except The Wrath of Khan. And it's something Klingon Academy did as well. Although Klingon Academy actually used beams, which is better, they still used this completely wrong and non-Star Trek sounding phaser effect. But, I'll get to that when we get to that. The torpedo sound, though, is great. It's nice and powerful, it's beefy, it sounds perfectly like a torpedo. Love it. Which brings me neatly, I guess, onto the audio. As I said, weapon sounds, some of them are a bit flat or wrong, but otherwise, some of it is really good. There's good background noise on the bridge, and there's stations, unlike DS9 Harbinger. However, this is going to be really nitpicky, so I apologise, but some of the computer sounds, it's not just Starfleet, but they're from other races or even future eras like Deep Space Nine as well. This is a problem I've actually noticed in New Trek, particularly I noticed this in Picard Season 3, like all the bridge sounds. They're using the correct Star Trek sounds, but they're using them in the wrong context. So, for example, you'll hear a Cardassian computer noise, or a Bajoran computer noise, or something like that. Or maybe you'll hear the door chime from DS9 being used on the bridge, and it just bothers me. I'm sorry, it's so nitpicky, but it does bother me, because usually in the older series, certain sounds have certain contexts. So you have a certain sounds for arming weapons, raising shields, engaging a particular course, the door chimes. You know what those sounds are associated with.
Come, Captain. You are being hailed. Fired it well. Launching torpedoes. Engage.
And that's so drilled into my head that when I hear them out of context, like, no, that shouldn't be there. That's wrong. Very minor complaint. As I said, very nitpicky. I'm sorry. One of the actual genuine problems I had with the audio, though, was the audio spam from Robin, your engineer. So every time your shields get hit, go down, or a system goes down, he will report this. And so you just have this constant spam of
forward shields have been hit. Upper shields have been hit. Forward life support has been hit. Starboard shields repaired. Upper shields repaired. Port side shields have been hit. Lower shields have been hit. Upper shields have been hit. Phasers have been hit.
And it's just constant, non-stop, as long as you're in combat, and it's irritating. It didn't need to be that regular all the time. I get that you, as a player, need to be aware of the status of your ship, but you have your indicator at the bottom with the UI, which shows your shield status and your hull status, which I guess I should obviously mention, which I didn't mention in the graphics section. The user interface is perfectly serviceable, a little bit basic, particularly with the shields, ventral and dorsal shields. This is this tiny little blue bubble to show your basically your upper and lower shields, whereas the forward, starboard, port and aft shields, they're fine. And then off on the right hand side you have both your radar and your torpedo phaser loadout. But anyway, going back to the audio, there were also two missions in particular that had like this really loud background constant audio, because they were coming from like this organic being or something that drowned out the dialogue, and it was just a pain to listen to, and even more so if you have to end up redoing the mission, which I did for at least one of these, so it just really stood out to me. The music is pretty good. It's nothing intrusive or annoying. It's very in keeping with the Star Trek atmosphere, particularly for the Federation side. The music was done by Ron Jones, who did a lot of work for the first 3 or 4 seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation, before the music in classic Trek basically became generic cookie cutter music that was not memorable at all. So yeah, I think that pretty much concludes my critiques of the game. It was enjoyable. As I said, coming off the back of DS9 Harbinger, this was so much more enjoyable and fun to play. Aside from occasionally getting frustrated due to poor mission scripting or outright bugs, I was never hating the game. I didn't feel bored. I was engaged with it. It was fine. As flight sims go, as I said, pretty average. The things like Wing Commander, X-Wing vs TIE Fighter, those sort of things, they are superior games in my opinion. But as Star Trek games go, this is definitely worth the play if you can get it up and running, so I do highly recommend it. So, next we will be playing Klingon Academy. This uses the same engine as Starfleet Academy, heavily modified of course. I will not be using any mods or other graphical enhancements except for things like widescreen support or any community patches for fixing bugs, because I want to play and review the game as it was, as tempting as it might be to install better graphical mods. But yeah, I just want to play it as is. However, if you in the comments would like to object to that, or if you think I should play with graphical mods, let me know. But I think this is a better way to just, examine these games for what they were, as they were at the time. So there you go. Thank you very much for joining me through my Let's Play of Starfleet Academy. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this review has been reasonably fair. And yeah, do join me next time for Klingon Academy, which will be happening soonish. I might record 1 or 2 episodes in advance, so I at least have something done for a couple of weeks, but we'll see how it goes. I need to at least install the game and get it running first to make sure I'm happy with how everything's set up. But yeah, expect that to come in the near future. But until that time, do take care.